Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you again for tuning in. If you are one of our regular viewers at 11 o'clock here on the East Coast of the United States. And if you're new to what we're up to here, we're trying to review the course, the AP US History course, with you. Without further ado, let's get right into doing that. And today we're going to spend some time looking at finishing up Unit 3 or Period 3, depending on how you want to look at that. And so yesterday we had a nice review of the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution of the United States and the beginnings of government in the U.S. Really, Ms. Farr did that, and she is manning the Twitter today. So again, if you have questions about what we're doing today, please tweet them at virtualapush. You can see that on the screen there off to the right. My name is Mr. Horton from Williamsville South High School, just outside of Buffalo, New York. So we're going to get started here right away. So if you have questions, we'll also try to throw some questions at you on Twitter. So please feel free to tweet them. So opening question is for you to think a little bit about what's the difference between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. So we sometimes talk about these two things, and you'll see how that plays into what we're going to cover today at as we wrap up Period 3 or Unit 3 of the course. So the letter of the law is the actual language of the law. It's what it actually says. But the spirit of the law is what the intention of the law is. And I think you'll see when we get to a couple things here down the road in George Washington's presidency that there's going to be some difference between those two things and whether or not we stick to what exactly the law says versus what the intention of the law was. So our overview today, we're going to do those periods 3.10 to 3.13. Really, it's pretty much George Washington's presidency and the presidency of John Adams, kind of wrapping those things up. So we started with the Revolution 2 days ago. We spent yesterday looking at the struggles to create the Constitution, which gets put into place. And we finished that up yesterday. So we're going to move into how we take that Constitution and make it work. How did, especially George Washington, as president, make that Constitution, that written document, into a truly living document? How did they make it happen? And then we'll review the trends of the period here. So you might call this the Federalist era, even though Washington didn't consider himself to be a member of either of the two political parties. Really, his policies aligned pretty closely with the Federalists. So the question about why George Washington, why would he be the first president? Well, he's a national hero. He, of course, is the hero of the Revolution. By the time the Constitution is being written, his birthday is already being celebrated as a national holiday. He refuses on several occasions to take over autocratic authority in the U.S. He could have been a dictator had he chosen to be that, had he been more ambitious, but he chose not to, which actually makes people more respect him even more. And he doesn't want to roll in the national government, but he knew he was needed. Much like when he goes to the Constitutional Convention, he had already, served his country as, the leader of the Continental Army during the Revolution. But his country called, and of course he responded to that call and went out to the Constitutional Convention and helped to oversee that. And at his funeral, one of the eulogists at his funeral referred to him as first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. And of course, he's also our first president. So he's a hero for a lot of different reasons. Let's take a look at a quick clip here.
I think one big thing people get wrong about Washington is that they don't think he's human. They assume that he a big block of marble who just got stuck into the office. And they don't realize the degree to which he really didn't know what he was doing, nor did anybody else. And he was figuring it out one step at a time.
It's so hard to understand Washington, the person. I say he's an enigma. He realized that everything he did was being watched, and that historians were going to be looking back at his actions. And so in his writing, in his performance, he was always very guarded.
There's a story about someone towards the end of his presidency saying something along the lines of, "You look kind of relieved to be stepping down." And Washington said, "I don't look relieved. No one ever knows what I feel in this office." So he clearly was trying very hard to not emote in any way, and again, to act like whatever he thought a president was supposed to be. I think he was aware the degree to which Literally everything he did, what he wore, how he walked, did he shake hands with people or not shake hands with people. Everything he did set a precedent, and he knew that. And that was a challenge. And everyone was watching him for the slightest hint that he was going to take too much power.
When George Washington entered the presidency, he was facing a major crisis from the get-go. And that crisis was, how does the presidency function? And so Washington really established the foundation of the presidency. So some things like, for instance, the responsibility of the president for foreign affairs, that wasn't clear in the Constitution. And it was Washington who clarified that really the president was the representative abroad. One of the other things Washington did as president was to really establish how the cabinet would function. The cabinets would be advisors and would be in charge of all the departments.
I think he was trying really hard to be responsible. He didn't always make the right choice. He was a partisan, although he was trying to be an umpire of sorts. The fact is he was a Federalist. He agreed more with Hamilton than he did ultimately with Jefferson. But that said, he was trying so hard to make the responsible choice that would have the right impact for posterity.
Washington really understood how to manage organizations to get things done. I don't know that Washington was the greatest communicator. I don't know that he needed to be, but he was a model for executive leadership.
Washington was a good president because he was aware that he was setting precedents, and he was careful about that, and he was thinking about impact and posterity, and that was important.
John Adams once said of George Washington that he was the greatest actor the presidency had ever known. And I think that is really telling. He knew that his role as president was to be a performer. And he was able to establish not only the presidency, but the Constitution itself as a viable document.
Okay. So lots of different precedents, and I won't spend a lot of time talking about these things here, but so they actually mentioned a couple of them in the clip here. So the cabinet actually being created by Washington, that's not in the Constitution. So Washington figured out a way to organize the executive branch of government and creates the cabinet. We sometimes refer to that as part of the unwritten Constitution, these laws that, or these ways that our government functions that aren't written down. Talk about spirit of the law versus letter of the law is a good example of that. And then the two-term precedent is one of the most important ones. And at the end of his second term, he decided he no longer wished to be president and chose to retire. And that became the pattern for presidents up until Franklin Roosevelt, who ultimately runs for and wins a third and then ultimately a fourth term as president. But that's a story for a different day. So Washington, of course, creates the cabinet, as they mentioned in the video here. The problem in this cabinet is the two gentlemen that you see here, Thomas Jefferson, who's seated on the left, and Alexander Hamilton, who's standing just behind him. These two gentlemen disagreed on most things, and they eventually their ideas eventually will lead to the creation of the first party system. So divided is a good way to think about them. Of course, you have Hamilton over here on the left, and then Jefferson over there on the right, and they disagreed on most of the major issues of the day, and they're both members of Washington's first cabinet. Hamilton was the first Secretary of the Treasury, and Jefferson was the first Secretary of State. And Washington would seek advice from these two gentlemen, and of course, it was almost always on opposite sides of things. So Hamilton saw the United States as becoming a manufacturing society. We were going to be an urban society that was going to eventually compete with Europe as far as industry was concerned. And Jefferson, of course, saw this as the future of the United States, that America would be a country of gentlemen farmers. And those two things are going to sort of color the way that they view all kinds of the other issues that we're going to talk about. So the Federalists, let's talk about them. Federalists, you might call them the party of order. They believed in a powerful national government. So while they have the same name as the folks that were in favor of a constitution being written during the ratification debate, they're not always the same. And we'll talk about one of those examples in just a moment here. But the Federalists believed the national government needed to be strong. They tended to be made up of merchants, bankers, landowners. So these tended to be more upper class people, although that's not always the case, but generally speaking. New England is a center of support, but you do have some wealthy people in the South that also would belong to the Federalist Party. They believed that government should be controlled by the rich, by the well-born, by the well-educated, and they distrusted the common man. So these are people that didn't necessarily believe that every single person in America ought to have an influence or a say over what was going on in the United States. Not they shouldn't maybe not everybody should have a vote would be one example of things. They didn't trust the masses to always make the right decision, and they tended to favor Britain in foreign policy. They sort of saw themselves in one sense. In fact, their political opponents would call them the monarchist party. That some people saw them as trying to imitate England a little too much. England, of course, having a powerful national government that's an industrializing society and an urban society. Now, the other party, which is headed by Jefferson, of course, are called the Jeffersonian Republicans, or sometimes the Democratic Republicans. Some historians refer to them as the Party of Liberty. So they're more interested in a weaker national government. They preferred state government. So of the two founding documents that we talked about yesterday, Ms. Farr talked about the Articles of Confederation. These are folks that would have seen the Articles as probably a little bit better version of things. They didn't like the national government being powerful, tended to be made up of shop owners, city workers, so more working class type folks, more middle class type folks. Again, these are broad generalizations here. So just a comparison point here, the little blue arrows. The South and the West tended to be the basis of support. Farmers definitely supporting Jefferson. They believed, the Jeffersonians did, that government should be controlled by capable leaders. So they're more in tune with the Enlightenment idea of careers being open to people that have talent, not necessarily, you know, what family you belong to, or are you in the or aristocracy, which would have been the case in England. They believed if you demonstrated ability that you ought to have the opportunity to potentially be a leader. And of course, they trusted the common man, favored individual liberties. They wanted people to be left alone. The interpretation piece, we'll talk about that in just a second. And the Jeffersonians tended to favor France. They saw France as America's ally during the American Revolution, and especially when the French have their own revolution. The Jeffersonians will very much be in sympathy with that revolution, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the interpretations piece, there is a clause in the Constitution that's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And this is how it reads: Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. There's a list in the Constitution of things that the national government can do. But then they stuck this on the end. So Congress can also make any law which are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the list of powers that are in the Constitution. So this is often referred to as the elastic clause. And as I put a couple questions here at the bottom, just hopefully some food for thought. Why do you think, what was the purpose of a clause like this being added to the Constitution? Well, Ms. Farr yesterday talked about the Constitution being flexible. The founders didn't know everything that was going to happen. For example, there's nothing in the list that says we can build a space shuttle program, but is it necessary? Is it proper? Well, yes, then the national government, of course, can do that. And then the other question is, what is the danger of a clause like this? And Jefferson saw this as a very dangerous clause. So he believed in a strict interpretation of this. Jefferson would have said, to go back to our opening question, what's the letter of the law? What exactly does it say in the Constitution? Where Hamilton would be more in favor of a loose interpretation of this clause. Well, what's the spirit of it? The spirit of it is that the national government should have powers that maybe aren't necessarily listed here. And we're going to talk about a specific example of that in just a second. So let's just take a second, give you a little chance to practice here. Here's a quote from Alexander Hamilton. What's his point of view? We'll get the timer started here for you. A quick shout out to Mark O for Mrs. McGinnis's class. Apparently he gets a free sandwich if we give him a shout out. So enjoy that sandwich, Mark. So what is Hamilton saying in this question? We can't always trust the average citizen. That government should be insulated from the people. That, in other words, we shouldn't take a vote of everybody. He talks about a permanent body being in this. So without just for the sake of time, we'll kind of speed along here with this a little bit. And you can see Hamilton, the actual historical character, on the right, and Hamilton, the famous Broadway version of Hamilton, on the left there. So Hamilton's views would have supported the idea of a Supreme Court, which of course is appointed by the president and approved by Congress, approved by the Senate. But after that, they no longer have to run for re-election. They're insulated from politics. They don't have to worry about running for re-election. So based on the excerpt, Hamilton would probably support which of these things? Let's think about it together. Which of the things makes the most sense based on the quote, right? What is Hamilton saying? That the mass of people is not really, we shouldn't always trust that. So he's not going to believe in this. B is true, but that's not really based on the excerpt. So the best example from the excerpt is property qualifications. Not everybody should have a vote. Only folks that own property, which means people of that are not necessarily lower class, is essentially what he's saying here. And we're actually going to cover that in the next little bit here. So we'll talk about that. So Hamilton, as the Secretary of the Treasury, comes up with this very famous financial plan, funding and assumption, which are the first two parts of that the federal government's going to pay its debts, is essentially what those two things mean, to kind of keep this more of a review. A mild protective tariff to help industries is part of that. The tax on whiskey, and the national bank. And this is the thing that's going to really create a lot of division between Hamilton and Jefferson. So the easy way to remember these things is BFAT, bank, excise tax, funding assumption, and the tariff. So it's kind of a quick little mnemonic device down there at the bottom. So the national bank is not listed in the Constitution. And Jefferson is going to say, hey, this isn't written down in the Constitution. We need to follow the letter of the law. And hopefully some of you are thinking that Jefferson doesn't always follow that when he becomes president. We'll talk about that on Monday. Hamilton, though, of course, says, well, the spirit of the law is that the national government does have the right to regulate the economy. We should be able to do this. I think this is a good idea, and we should do this. It's necessary and it's proper. So it's okay for us to do this. And again, the two men, their ideas eventually are going to turn into the two main political parties of the first party system, as they sometimes refer to it. And the tax on whiskey will lead to a rebellion.
But Washington also had trouble on the domestic front, which threatened to tear apart the country's young democracy. In the summer of 1794, an armed insurrection of farmers and frontiersmen challenged the authority of federal tax collectors over a whiskey tax.
People in western Pennsylvania, they have a gun battle with the local revenue collector. The commander of the local militia is killed. A couple other people are killed and injured. And then the whole countryside is like enraged.
The whiskey rebels, they remembered that the Revolutionary War had been all about excessive taxation. There's a direct line that runs from the rebels of 1776 and the whiskey rebels of the 1790s.
Washington understood the threat this defiance posed to the country, but it also handed him an opportunity to cement the federal government's authority by putting the powers of the president into practice.
Washington marched troops into western Pennsylvania to suppress this revolt. The idea that the government was willing to do that and did that kind of action was really a strong statement.
The rebellion was put down without a shot ever being fired. After getting word that an army was marching out to meet them and that Washington was leading it, the rebels retreated to their homes.
Okay, so there's an actual uprising. So, and in this case, the federal government demonstrates its ability to deal with that. They actually send an armed force out to put it down. And so this demonstrates the power of the Constitution. See, let's do a little Twitter question here. So what was the rebellion that proved the weakness of the Articles of Confederation? What was the name of that rebellion that showed that the Articles really weren't all that effective of a government? So the Whiskey Rebellion, of course, is a demonstration that American citizens have not forgotten the example of the American Revolution, but it also demonstrates that Washington will, in fact, enforce the laws of the country. So, and this is also a good example of a backwoods rebellion, this sort of more Western, more frontier type culture rising up against the more Eastern culture, which is typical of rebellions dating all the way back to Bacon's rebellion from the colonial era. Might make a connection there. Jay's Treaty, one of the things that Washington has to do is to settle issues between the United States and other European countries. So here's one example. Jay's Treaty is a treaty with England. So what's happened in the meantime is England and France have gone to war with one another again. And if you were watching yesterday, you know that that's not anything new. Between William's War and Anne's War and George's War and 7 Years' War, this is just one more time England and France going at it again. But the British were beginning to seize our ships on the high seas and impress sailors, which means kidnap them. So Washington wants to work this out. Now remember, the Federalists are more pro-Britain in their foreign policy. So he sends John Jay, who was a representative from New York. He's one of the more forgotten founding fathers, and this might be the reason why this treaty that he signs. So you notice if you read through some of the terms of that treaty, there is nothing said in there about impressment. There really isn't a whole lot of promise from the English to do very much of anything, but it was viewed by Washington's administration and definitely John Jay as a way of sort of smoothing over the issues with England that, the US will allow the British privateers in US ports, is one example of things to kind of smooth things over a little bit. The U.S. can continue trading with the British West Indies. It's a demonstration by the U.S. government that, we want to work with England here and that we're probably not as much on the side of Britain. So let's just take a second to, not a second, but 40 seconds to read through this. What's his point of view? This is a letter from Jefferson to Madison regarding Jay's Treaty. All right. So Jefferson writing to his close friend, James Madison. What does he say here? So general a burst of dissatisfaction never before appeared against any transaction. A lot of people are angry about this treaty is what he's saying. Those people that actually understand it, condemn it. Those who don't really understand it in detail, condemn it anyway, is what he's saying here. And then at the bottom, he says, it has, in my opinion, completely demolished the monarchical party here. So what party do you think that Jefferson is referring to in that? We'll let you tweet that question. Harshdeep Banga got our first question first, but our star student Liliana got it right behind, about a second behind for that first question. So what party do you think Jefferson is referring to here when he says the monarchical party is being demolished by that? Okay. So the question here is, which of the following was an important consequence of the debate over that? Actually, we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail in just a second. So it's going to show some of the disagreements between the Jeffersonians and the Federalists, and that's really the point of this. Okay, let's try this question. Jefferson's reaction to Jay's Treaty, as expressed in this letter, was a direct reflection of what? So of course, Jefferson's not referring to economic policy here. He's not talking about expansion to the West. He's talking about the impact of the French Revolution, that the Federalist Party seems to be siding a little bit more with the British, where of course the Jeffersonians tended to side a little bit more with the French. The next country that needed to be dealt with was Spain, and this actually is a result of Jay's Treaty indirectly. The British were a little concerned about what the US and Britain were negotiating in Jay's Treaty. So there's a treaty signed between the United States and Spain. And this is a treaty that the main thing here is it gave Americans the right of what was called navigation and deposit. So you see that this is, of course, Louisiana here, granted to Spain. As a result of the last war, and the Mississippi River will be a really important river, a highway for trade. And the United States, of course, didn't control it at this point. The Spanish did. So what the right of navigation meant is that the settlers that lived out here west of the Appalachian Mountains, they now could use the Mississippi River for trade. And of course, the Mississippi is going to extend all the way up here. And the right of deposit meant that they had the right to sell their products in the market at New Orleans. So this is going to be definitely a good thing for the settlers that are out here as the United States is growing and expanding. We're going to need access to those things. So the Spanish grant us access to that as a result of this treaty. So Pinckney, of course, was the person that negotiated that treaty for the United States. Now, at the same time, Spain is expanding their empire into California, way out on the west coast of the United States. And these are called the missions that eventually are spread out there. You can see on the map, there's a whole bunch of them that are being created here at the same time that Washington is president. And Spain is extending its control up into North America. It's sort of the upper limit or the northern limit of the Spanish Empire. They're going to use the labor of Native Americans, much as they had done throughout much of the colonial period. So this is going on at the same time that the Pinckney's Treaty is being negotiated. Battle of Fallen Timbers is a deal with a treaty with Native Americans. So this is also an issue that Washington's going to have to deal with on the home, you could say on the home front. Or in the western frontier for sure. The Battle of Fallen Timbers is a battle where the United States defeated Native American tribes, and they signed a treaty to grant to cede some of their land, give it to the United States. And this is the beginning, maybe not the beginning isn't maybe the right way of putting that, but it continues that pattern of conflict between American Indian claims and the federal government or white settlement on different lands here. So this will be a pattern that will continue over and over and over and over again until we get into the late 1800s, which would be later on in the course, of course. So, but Washington is dealing with Native American issues on the frontier. He also has to contend with the French. And the French, of course, undergo their own revolution in 1789. It was modeled after the American Revolution. It's inspired by the Enlightenment. Just as a short example, and the image that you see here is the storming of the Bastille, which took place on July the 14th, which becomes their national holiday, much like July the 4th is our national holiday. In the early phases of this, most Americans were sympathetic to the revolution because, hey, it sounds a lot like our own revolution. But as the revolution wore on, of course, eventually the king and queen of France were killed. And so other countries around Europe went to war against France. And you have to remember that France and the United States had signed a treaty during the American Revolution called the Franco-American Alliance. And the French hoped that we would honor that alliance, that we would come to their aid and fight. But Washington instead issues what's called the Proclamation of Neutrality in 1793, saying that America is not going to get involved in the wars of the French Revolution. So this is, again, going on at the same time as Jay's treaty. That's why Jay was sent to England to smooth things over with England to make sure that they knew we weren't going to honor the Franco-American alliance. And of course, think about which party in America is going to be upset about us not following through on the Franco-American alliance. And that, of course, would be the Jeffersonians. And the last thing with George Washington's presidency is his farewell address, a very famous farewell address. His and President Eisenhower, much later in the late 1950s, are the two most well-known of the farewell addresses. But Washington, in this case, it's sort of a goodbye note, if you want to call it that way. He never actually gave it as a speech. It was more of a letter. But what he did here in that farewell address is sort of gave his last advice to the United States. Might be one way of thinking about it. As he's retiring from the presidency in 1796, 1797, getting ready to go off to Mount Vernon and retirement, he decides to let America know what he thinks he's learned over the course of all of his experiences. And he warns us against two things. One is the dangers of political parties and the fact that Jefferson and Hamilton disagreed on pretty much everything. would continue to do that, as we'll see. He believed that political parties were dangerous. It made people think only one way. It caused people to be closed-minded. It caused people to hate one another unnecessarily. So imagine what Washington might think if he were to read some Facebook posts or Twitter feeds or that kind of thing today. He believed that this was not a good thing for democracy, and that's why he tried while he was president to kind of stay above it. And you can see in the cartoon, you have the two different political parties sort of pulling at the pillars that are holding up the United States, which actually says, and it's a little unclear here, but it says, united we stand, divided we fall. That if we allow the two political parties to keep tugging at the base of our country, that this could be essentially, this could potentially be a very bad thing for the U.S. So, and you'll see from our consequent history after this that we don't really follow Washington's advice on that one. The second one, the notice to beware of permanent alliances, we do in fact follow. Washington believes it's really important to stay neutral, continuing that trend from the Neutrality Proclamation, which we just mentioned. And the United States signed an alliance with France in 1778 called the Franco-American Alliance. The next permanent military alliance the United States would sign would not be till 1949, after World War II, when we sign on to NATO. So this one we do in fact listen to. So Washington, we got 1 out of 2 right, I guess, if you want to think of it that way. So let's do a couple quick questions here. Here's a little quote from the farewell address. What is Washington's point of view that you can see in this quote? All right. So hopefully you're seeing it. This is a very famous quote. This is the one that most people typically cite when they talk about the farewell address. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations. We want to trade with you, but we don't want to have any political connection. We're not going to sign any alliances with you. So which of the following developments, let's see, can we answer this question? Let's see. I think that one's a little too easy. Let's go on to the next one here. What central idea from Washington's address was brought into focus by the controversy about the French Revolution? So we'll get the timer started here. This one's a little tougher of a question because a lot of these sound like they might be relatively good answers here. But the best answer out of those 4 is C, that these events that were happening overseas potentially divided the United States. And what he's talking about here really is the two political parties. The Jeffersonians believe we should be helping the French and are sympathetic to the French. They actually create what were sometimes called Jacobin clubs, which were clubs that were promoting the opposite policy of what the government was creating. Because remember, we don't have a tradition yet of a loyal opposition or a two-party system. Hasn't really happened yet with Washington. All right, let's try this one. This is a nice connection question. Washington's ideas most closely mirror the sentiments of American policymakers in which decade? So let's think about what's going on here. This is the classic, which of these things does not belong here, right? So what's Washington saying? Don't sign political alliances with anybody. Be isolated, be neutral. Which of those decades is a decade that we have America not being involved in other places in the world? And hopefully you identified it as the 1920s. Of course, in the 1890s, we have imperialism. 1940s is World War II. In the 1980s is Reagan and the Republican Party, really the United States, being involved in a lot of places trying to stop the spread of communism. So let's do Adams very quickly here. Adams is sometimes referred to as the greatest #2. He's always sort of behind other characters in the American Revolution story. Might be one way of looking at that. Adams deals with the same issues that Washington did. France wants us to join on in the war effort against England. France was angry because we were staying neutral and not following through on that promise. Jay's Treaty made it seem like we were even closer to England, so that makes France even more mad. So what does Adams do? He's trying to figure out a way to not get involved in a war that potentially could be devastating for the United States. So what does he do? He sends a commission to France to try to smooth over the problems between the two sides. They're ignored. They're asked to give a bribe to the foreign minister before that can happen. And of course, the United States is insulted that this would happen. How dare you not listen, even sit down and be willing to talk with us about that. In the meantime, Adams tries to figure out what to do. But in the meantime, the French Revolution experiences another phase change. In the French Revolution, the government changes quite a bit. And eventually, the whole thing is eventually negotiated out. But before that happens, there is what we sometimes call the quasi-war, which is an undeclared war. It's sort of a quasi is a word that means sort of, kind of, not exactly. That's a quasi definition of the word quasi for you there. So there actually is fighting taking place between Americans on the high seas and the French, although that's not actually declared as a war. In the meantime, of course, the Jeffersonians are promoting the idea that we ought to help France even more. And that leads Adams to sign on to these laws that are passed called the Alien and Sedition Act. So if you look at these, especially the second bullet point here, president can deport aliens who are suspected of having, quote, treasonable or secret leanings. So if we suspect you of leaning in the wrong way, and they don't mean, of course, physically leaning here, but politically, and criticizing the government or the president is a crime, you could actually go to jail for this. So which amendment to the Constitution is this a violation of? Which amendment would the opponents of this bill say is being violated by this law, that you can be deported for being suspected of having a treasonable or secret leaning, or that you're criticizing the government and can actually go to jail? This is actually the text of that amendment, or that law rather. If any person shall write, print, utter, or publish, or shall cause or procure to be written, printed, uttered, or published false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government or against any of these other things, you can be punished by a fine not more than $2,000 or be sent to jail for 2 years. So on our last question, Victoria Johansson, Jordan Henshey, I'm not sure if they got it right, but Miss McGinnis's class apparently needs a sandwich because I shout them out so they can get a sandwich as well. So apparently someone's getting breakfast out of all of this. So the Jeffersonians, of course, are going to oppose this. Jefferson believes in individual liberties. Again, think about what amendment he might be referring to when he criticizes this law. And what they do, what Jefferson and Madison do, is they write a series of resolutions that are passed by 2 state governments called the Kentucky and Virginia Resolution. And it outlines this idea that the states created the national government. So here's one way to sort of think about it, right? The states' rights side, the federal government derives its power from rights given to it by the citizens. Because the states created the U.S., individual states have the power to negate a federal law. Now, this is a little bit later down the road that we'll talk about nullification. But the thinking here is very similar to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson believed that individuals in the Declaration, he said, individuals give up power to a government, and therefore those individuals can take that power back from government if it becomes destructive. So they basically take that argument and they expand it. And they say that states gave up some of their powers to have the national union. Therefore, those states can take back that power if the national government becomes destructive of its purpose. And that will be a philosophy that we're going to continue talking about next week as we get into the Civil War, because that will become one sort of side of the story, that some people believe the states should be more powerful, much like the Articles of Confederation, much like the Jeffersonians, of course, are going to argue here. And the Federalist side, of course, the other side, they disagree with that. They believe the national government is the national government, and that states don't have the right to override it. When you think about how that might work, if each state could sort of decide whether it wanted to follow the rules or not. And a good example might be if your parents gave you a whole series of rules and you could decide which ones you thought were reasonable and which ones you thought were not reasonable. We could call that, children's rights or teenagers' rights. How effective would those rules be if you could just simply say, well, I'm not going to follow that one because I don't think that that's really a fair rule? Food for thought. And our last little subject, and then we'll do a little wrap up here for you. America continues to grow, of course, in this period. New forms of culture begin to develop after the Revolution. We want to identify ourselves as not quite being English anymore. We want to be something different than that. That's the whole purpose of the Revolution. So some examples of this in architecture. You'll see some examples like this, the layout of Washington, D.C., which is put together by Pierre L'Enfant, these broad avenues that are sort of stretched out all over the place. And if you've ever visited the National Mall, this little region in here is a little confusing sometimes because the streets aren't always in a grid pattern, and that's done certainly on purpose. We wanted to create a national capital that's going to be reflective of our greatness. In artworks, you get things like John Trumbull, who paints this very famous scene of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and all the different signers are put here in lots of different places. And of course, eventually Trumbull would post this on his Twitter page and ask people to tag themselves in it, if there was Twitter, but there wasn't, of course. So celebrating, right, these great events that took place in American history. A little joke there for you, a little Twitter joke. Yorktown, of course, is the last battle of the American Revolution. We're going to celebrate that with these images, right? Images of Washington, the great, first president of the United States and leader of the Revolution. This is a statue of Washington. And the Washington Monument eventually will be planned. All these things, of course, celebrating the early independent culture of the United States. In architecture, Monticello, which is Jefferson's home in Virginia, of course, takes some elements of ancient Greek styles. You can sort of see the Greek columns that are here. And he merges that a little bit with his own style. So sort of developing his own version of architecture here, a little bit different than the Europeans. This is also designed by Jefferson. You can see the similarity between this and his home. This is the famous rotunda at the University of Virginia, also designed by Jefferson. And again, you see this over and over again, the Boston State House in Boston, with the Capitol building there, the big dome, which is kind of similar to the dome that you see here. This is actually the original design of the Capitol building. Of course, the dome part of it is a little bit different and a little bit bigger building than what it was originally designed for. But and the White House, James Hoban, who was the architect that put together the plans for the White House, you can see sort of the rudimentary outlines of it here. In this image. And Hoban would actually come back to Washington to help rebuild the White House after it gets burned in the War of 1812, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Of course, you begin to get songs like this, Hail Columbia, Columbia being another word to refer to the United States. And the literature that we see, it really is stuff that we talked about yesterday, so I can kind of go through that a little bit more quickly with you. Focusing around political writings like Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson. Certainly Benjamin Franklin as a writer would have been celebrated as well. Almanacs were not something that the British had. This is an American development. So showing, again, our independence, and that will continue to grow into the early 1800s when we get there. Americans will continue moving westward, creating clashes with natives and European colonists. The remaining European influence in America, and we'll talk about that a little bit on Monday. And as slavery expanded in the Deep South and moved westward, a growing anti-slavery attitude grew in the North after the Revolution. So in the Northwest Territory, the Northwest Ordinance actually outlawed slavery in the northwestern part of the young United States. And so you begin to get the separation between the anti-slavery or non-slavery sections of the country and the pro-slavery sections of the country. So again, this is a great little map that sort of shows you areas that are beginning to be filled in as the United States continues to grow. Definitely here along the Ohio River. I know Ms. Farr mentioned this yesterday, that you would continue to hear about this. And by 1820, even further to the west along the Ohio River here, deeper into the more western region of the Deep South here, also being settled at the same time. So let's do a couple practice questions here and wrap things up. So what trends are depicted here, but more importantly, how could we use this if we were thinking about a DBQ? How might it show or the contribution of the growth of regional attitudes about slavery? What does this tell us about that? So hopefully you're noticing that the dark line, the solid line, is the North, and the number of enslaved Africans brought to that region of the country basically stops in that 1771 to 1780 period. So and while it goes down in the other two regions as well, you can see in the upper South, as we sometimes will refer to it, that it also is going to make its way down to zero. But in the Carolinas and Georgia, the deeper part of the South, you see that while it goes down, it doesn't completely end. And that will be a trend that we'll continue to see in America. So a quick overview, you might call this the Age of Washington. We started our story with Washington helping to start the French and Indian War at the beginning of it, and we really ended it with the end of the influence of Washington, who will die in 1799. So his political career sort of matches period 3 kind of nicely. So America begins as the colonial partner of Britain. French and Indian War leads to increasing conflict between the mother country and the colonies. We get ideas about independence from a whole bunch of different areas, and I talked about that 2 days ago. Americans begin to experiment with their own forms of government, both in state constitutions and the Articles, and eventually the Constitution, which replaces the Articles. And then Washington and Adams begin to breathe life into the Constitution and create institutions to make that Constitution work. So think about what happens over the course of that period. We start as a colony of Britain, and we end up being a nation defined by Enlightenment ideas and defined by our experiences in gaining that independence and making the whole thing work. Some of the themes that we hit here a little bit: the power of the national government. There's a debate early on in the period between the power of the British government and the power of the colonies, and that really is the root of the revolution. There's some experiments with the Articles and the Constitution itself. The Articles believes that the national government should be more weak. The Constitution believes that the national government should be more powerful. So it's essentially that same argument happening here. The two-party system really is an argument over that same question: the power of the national government. The Federalists believed that the national government should be powerful, and the the Jeffersonians do not believe that the national government should be quite so powerful. And we saw that in examples like the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions and some of the events that we talked about today. Another theme is in the period establishing an independent presence in North America. At first, we're really part of the British Empire, and so there isn't really an independent presence in North America. But as we begin to resist and then eventually revolt against the British Empire, we begin to eventually declare an independent presence in North America and then win that independence in the American Revolution. And then once the revolution is won, the question then becomes, how do we preserve preserve that independence and then increase it. So you have things like that treaty with Spain, for example, the Pinckney's Treaty, that helps us to make sure that we have access to the things that we need in the West. And then defining democratic government. So again, thinking about what does democracy mean? We start with the British tradition of salutary neglect, which then changes, where, in other words, we're allowed to have our own democratic government. We kind of develop our own forms of that, things like the House of Burgesses and town meetings, but that changes after 1763. And then representation debates shift to debates over natural rights. So the question over, are we represented in the British Parliament, shifts into a debate over what our natural rights should be. What is democracy actually supposed to look like? And then when we become a newly independent nation, we begin to question what that democracy should look like in a different way. How democratic should our nation be? Hamilton believes you can't always trust the masses, where Jefferson, of course, has a very different answer to that question. Does this include women? What about slavery? Is slavery compatible with democratic government? Will be a question that we'll continue to deal with in the period. So let's just do a couple quick questions here, and then we'll call it a day. So what's the difference between the two quotes that you see here, the two documents? And I'm being told that Emma Kolick needs a shout out to Mr. Kish from North Royalton, Ohio. So there you go with that. So what's the difference between these two things? Hopefully, even just by looking at the titles, you can begin to figure out what the answer to the question is here. Of course, the Articles believes that the state is more powerful, and the US Constitution believes that the national government is more powerful or more important. So let's try a couple quick multiple choice questions. Which of the following best explains the change that occurred between those two? All right, so what's changing between the Articles and the creation of the Constitution? So that's really what this question is asking. And the answer is internal disunity. And so earlier on, I asked you a question about which rebellion was the rebellion that proved that the Articles really were not all that effective. And the name of that rebellion, of course, is Shays Rebellion, which Ms. Farr talked about yesterday. So it shows the government was not effective. Let's try this one. So this one is a little tricky because they're asking you which thing would the Articles, the authors of the Articles, oppose more so than the framers of the US Constitution. And hopefully you got this one. Growth of the power of the national government. Okay. Central to the contrast between these two passages is the debate over the balance between which thing here. So hopefully if you just take a quick glance through the answers here, hopefully you're recognizing that this should be A, centralized authority versus more local governments. Again, the theme I just reviewed with you just a second ago. Opponents of the content of the US Constitution sought to restore some of the protections by, and again, Ms. Farr talked about this yesterday, what's the thing that limits the power of the national government is the Bill of Rights, which is its purpose, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And which of the following resulted most directly from the replacement of the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution? And of course, what ends up the best answer here is the steady growth in partisan debates about the nature of government. What do they mean by that partisan? They're talking about political parties here. Jefferson versus Hamilton. They're the first two political parties in American history. Continue that debate. So thank you again for watching. Hopefully you'll tune in again on Monday when we will start period 4, which is the Jeffersonian presidency, and we'll do some work with the market revolution. But a good chunk of that day will be focused on DBQ skills. So we're working more of those skills into our lessons each day. So we also have a surprise special guest on Monday, and he actually will start off our lesson on Monday morning. So hopefully you can tune in to see him as well. So thanks again for watching. Here's a question for you to think about over the weekend. We'll start next week with this. A quick shout out to Mrs. Wilson and Ms. Pop from Marcus Love High School. A little shout out to you from the Twitter feed, and don't be afraid to tweet more questions at that @virtualapush. So the practice question for Monday is to think about in what ways were the Jeffersonian Republican presidents, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, how are they similar to Washington and Adams, what we talked about today, and in what ways were they different? So I will try to frame Monday around that question, doing a little comparison work between the Jeffersonian presidents and what you could call the Federalist presidents. So thanks once again for tuning in. Hopefully we'll see you again next week, and have a great weekend.